So when I was a kid, if there was a movie I liked and I learned it was based on a book, I would generally try to go seek out the book. And some of the time I was not impressed by the source material. Most of the time I thought the source material was better than the movie. And then there were a few cases where the book really, really impressed me. And in one case, actually, I still liked the movie better, The Neverending Story. This is also the only one of these three books that I'm going to mention quickly that I have not reread as an adult. And it is the only one that is for children as opposed to adults. And the other two were for adults. The movies were for adults, but they were cartoons, they were animated, so they were understood as children's movies. But I thought the book was excellent. I've heard people say after watching the movie, they read the book, they weren't impressed. I loved the book as a kid. And I think I reread it a couple times as a kid. But I thought the movie was even better, which might be the effect of often the first version is something you see you like better. But I still thought both the movie and the book were amazing. And then the other two, the ones that were books and movies for adults, but the movies were animated. So Last Unicorn, even though it's a movie for adults, book for adults, I think children could watch this fine and could read this book fine aside from the language. And I reread this one recently. I reread this one a year or two ago, I think. And there's actually a more popular YouTube channel, Tale Foundry, I think, which I'll put that up I'll link it, did a video on this trying to get people to read it. And I was actually going to make a similar video saying, hey, you should read this book. And I'll probably still do that, but mine will be much shorter. This one is going into much more detail about the book and had a thesis about the fantasy of bringing things back, which I might actually build onto because there's other books that have that same theme. But it's an amazing book. He mostly wrote urban fantasy, and I'm not a fan, and I haven't liked his urban fantasy generally, but this book was amazing. I also liked the movie a lot as a kid, but I thought the book was better. And then finally, we had Watership Down by Richard Adams, which actually I only read in high school, and then I reread it because the Science Fiction Fantasy Book Club was reading it. And this is one, even though it's animated, was not a movie for kids, and I had nightmares as a result of some of the scenes in this movie, but it still stuck with me positively, which is why I read the book in high school and why I was happy to reread it. I think it's a great book. But one movie that I really loved as a kid that I did not read the original book is Mary Poppins. And the reason for this is that my father told me, oh yeah, the Mary Poppins in the book is very different and she's kind of mean. And I thought he was talking about, oh, she's like a harsh disciplinarian, but she's really not. And I'm realizing, I finally read this book because I was talking with someone, I'm like, I loved the movie as a kid. I have never read the book, and I actually think I should read it. Like, the idea that she was going to be a harsh disciplinarian isn't putting me off as an adult the way that it was when I was in elementary school. This one actually is like an elementary school age book. And so I read this book, and I realized what my father was talking about is, so you have this idea of primary versus secondary narcissism. And so primary narcissism is the narcissism of children, which is basically just not realizing that other people are people with feelings, with goals, with desires that are different from yours. And then you learn that, and then secondary narcissism, which is usually what we call narcissism, comes about as you sort of try to justify treating people as instruments, as things, rather than as people. And so Mary Poppins in this story comes across as a primary narcissist, as someone who basically thinks like a child. And actually in the book, it is basically stated that, yeah, Mary Poppins never grew up, which of course, another famous British character like that, Peter Pan. And I read that book, and I actually didn't see the Peter Pan animated movie until I was an adult. But I read the book when I was, I don't know, middle school age maybe. And I had seen the Peter Pan musical before then, which is closer to the Disney movie. And I'd also seen Hook, the Disney movie with Robin Williams, Hook. And so the story was different. The character of Peter Pan in that book is a toddler, and he also has some sort of the primary narcissism of children traits. And I haven't read it in a while, so I don't remember exactly what I remember. He came across as a kind of surprisingly callous, and Mary Poppins is sort of the same way in this series. She is very self-centered in a childlike way, and I think the implication maybe is that the magic of Mary Poppins is the magic that children and animals all experience and then adults lose, which is an interesting idea that is common to at least modern interpretation of fairy tales I've seen. But I found this idea of Mary Poppins as basically she's magical because she never grew up interesting for a couple of reasons. One of them is that I have kind of had a hypothesis that at least some kinds of neurodivergence are basically behavioral neoteny, which is consistent with, and I want to try to book this, and that's the book that, I've had books that I want to write that I think are more controversial, but this is the one that I tell people, and they're like, oh, that is going to be really controversial. So that's the one that people seem most potentially put off by, but that's a hypothesis I've had that I want to explore more. And The other interesting thing about it is, again, this idea of primary versus secondary narcissism, where a lot of people look at primary narcissism behavior in like other people, other cultures, and assume, oh, they can't learn to act in ways that we would, and they may not, depending on their values, but it's sort of developmental stages thing. And so I find the way that the writer depicts Mary Poppins as basically she has adult responsibilities, and so she writes her the way that you would write maybe a child of about 7 or 8 who has adult responsibilities but is still at that level of development, maybe younger even. And it is fascinating to me. And I actually started reading the second book, and that one actually, the movie borrowed a little bit from at least the first chapter of the second book, but I don't know if I'll read more of the series, but at least I want to read the second book. And if I ever have kids, I'm definitely going to read them this series because it is interesting and it has this very fairy tale-like quality to it. And I do think the Disney movie is more coherent, at least. And I've heard that the writer, and they actually made a movie about this, I think Saving Mr. Banks, where Walt Disney really wanted to adapt the book and she was skeptical. She was like, you're going to ruin it, you're going to mess it up. And Ursula Le Guin, when the Japanese animator Hayao Miyazaki adapted her Earthsea series, parts of it, she said, it's a great movie, but it's not my story. Maybe it was Howl's Moving Castle. It was either Ursula Le Guin with Earthsea or it was Diana Wynne Jones with Howl's Moving Castle. And both of those, Howl's Moving Castle is actually close to the prequel to that book, or the book before that one, Castle in the Air by Diana Wynne Jones, but it's different. I think it was Ursula Le Guin. But anyway, so the movie it has the same characters. So it has Mary Poppins, that she is some ways close to the character in the movie. And Jane and Michael have similarities as well. Mrs. Banks and Mr. Banks are both very different, and the other characters aren't really developed. So aside from some similarities to the characters and common plot points, the movie is completely different from the book, completely different feel. I feel like it is really well done and really well integrated. The book is more like a collection of sort of modern fairy tales, and I think they're both good in different ways, and I kind of wish I'd read this as a kid and ignored what my father was saying. Again, I thought strict disciplinarian was what he meant by mean, when it was really this much more interesting thing of she is very self-centered, but she can be kind and generous when she sort of realizes, oh, this might affect me this way, so I want to treat other people this way. And so, anyways, yeah, wanted to talk about this book and talk a little bit about these other 3 books, which I'll probably talk more about in the future, but read this book and I found it really interesting. So thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. This is Leela, and I'll see y'all in the next one.